Luke 18, Jesus tells a parable that is often called the parable of the persistent widow. In it, a widow repeatedly pleads for justice from a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. Although the judge initially ignored her, he eventually relented, not out of compassion, but because her persistence wore him down. Unraveling the meaning of this parable shouldn't really be that hard. After all, Luke began by flat out telling us what this parable is all about. Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. Theologically speaking, however, I find this parable problematic. It seems to suggest that God is reluctant to hear our prayers, that we must continually pester God with persistent prayer. The promise is that eventually we can wear God down and make God give us whatever we are asking for, right? To me, that hardly seems like a God who loves us. In fact, it implies a God that really doesn't love us very much at all. God treats us like petulant children, eventually just giving in and saying, okay, fine, you can have a cookie. The idea of such a reluctant God is pagan in origin, suggesting that all of our rituals are really just a way to get a reluctant God to do our bidding, by bribery if necessary. Humans can be corrupt and uncaring, but God is not. It is simply not in God's nature. Therefore, I believe that we are not supposed to read this parable like that at all. The real meaning behind this parable has to lie in the sharp contrast here between what God's idea of justice is and what our human idea of justice is. The key to unlocking this parable may be when Jesus says, "Will not God bring about justice?" He will see that they get justice, and quickly. The uncomfortable truth, however, is that the promise that God will bring about justice for his chosen ones remains just a promise, no matter how much we pester God about it. Justice in life, in fact, is rare. Or as we say more often, whoever said that life is fair anyway? It is possible that some persistence in this life might bring about some semblance of justice once in a while, but even that is often justice delayed. And as they like to say, justice delayed is justice denied. Maybe the better phrase would be, today is not looking so good for justice, maybe tomorrow. And then justice never seems to come. But then maybe it is not human justice that Jesus is talking about. We want to know when God is actually going to do something. On the other hand, I think that what God wants to know is whether we are going to do something. So as usual, we have a problem, not God. The parable finds its true meaning in the contrast between human justice and God's justice. The parable is not really about pestering God to fix the problem. It is about praying without ceasing in order to discover how we can join with God to help make an unjust world a little more just. The voice that we hear, the one that cries out to God and asks, "How long, O Lord?" is really waiting for us to answer on God's behalf and either do something that will make a difference or at least offer to share in their pain, because that matters to God. When Jesus pivots from parable to promise, with his assurance that God will do something, we hear him wondering out loud if we actually have the sort of faith that it will take, that will be active, insistent, and courageous in the face of injustice, much like the woman in the parable. In fact, maybe we should look more carefully at her. Did you notice that we never learn what this case was really about? It might have had something to do with an inheritance problem, perhaps. Or maybe her complaint was just with life itself, with her at the bottom of the rung now, forgotten and unloved. This could be her own general protest, that life for her and others like her should just be different than it is. Here she is, a vulnerable widow, confronting a corrupt judge and asking him to do something. Good luck with that. And yet, in the end, her voice, although marginalized, somehow became unstoppable. So perhaps the moral of the story is that God is always going to be on the side of justice. So we should be on that side too. And the question is, will we? Are we? When the Son of Man comes, will he find that sort of faith on earth in us? We think that faith is a noun and that it is all about being passive and meek and waiting for God to do something. But God sees faith as a verb and something that is active and engaged in the quest for a more just world. The widow's persistence may indeed also be a model for our prayer life, but if so, then it has to become a prayer that connects us with a righteous God, who then empowers us to seek what we can only gain if we persist. God's idea of justice will always be different than ours, though, because God's justice seeks restoration, not punishment, and it is intertwined with God's mercy. If that were not so, then there would not be grace for any of us. While human justice often focuses on punishment or fairness only in a transactional sense, divine justice always seeks right relationship, healing, and the flourishing of all creation. It seeks to heal what is broken, and not just to punish those who have done what is wrong. In essence, God's justice seeks to put an end to suffering, not just to transfer it from one person to another. So if we want to be on God's side when it comes to justice, we have to be on the side of grace, forgiveness, and transformation. The truth is that we cannot always make things right by inflicting pain, which is why revenge and vengeance always fail, because that is not justice. It is just the creation of more injustice. Vengeance seeks emotional satisfaction through harming others. God's justice seeks restoration through the creation of a right relationship. Vengeance is personal, reactive, and often disproportionate, while God's justice, in its true form, is always communal, principled, and future-oriented. That is why prisons need to become life-changing places, not just places of human suffering. Jesus once made the same point when he said, "You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." At first glance, there does not seem to be any sort of justice at all in doing that, at least in human terms. And that kind of response often doesn't end the injustice that exists either. And yet, it is still better than creating an endless cycle of pain for everybody. We saw the end of a war this week. While I am very glad for that, I hope to God that it leads to a better place than what existed when it all started, as it started for a reason. Justice was never served by what was, and certainly was not served by what has happened since. It could perhaps be better served in days to come, but only if we realize that each man's pain is also our own. We need to reach for something divine that has always been just beyond our understanding. As Martin Luther put it, returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night that is already devoid of stars. There are those who look to the cross now as the moment when God broke this terrible cycle of violence by absorbing the pain into himself. Because of that, because of the example of Jesus, forgiveness is no longer weakness. Instead, it has become a form of moral resistance that refuses to mirror the violence that it condemns. And I think it might be time for all of us to learn this truth. As for the woman in this parable, I don't know what she received from her day in court, if that's what it was. Some justice, I presume, in an unjust world, delivered at the hands of an unjust man. Or maybe it was just some small recognition of her plight, some overdue act of kindness. You know, maybe an act of Congress to ensure that at least she received a Social Security check in her old age. I believe that in God's eyes, justice is whatever keeps people from suffering. Therefore, I am for that too. Whatever justice may or may not mean in this world, because of the resurrection of Christ, we know that God's justice will triumph in the end, and God will bring about justice for his chosen ones. When that happens, may he not just find us praying, but also working to ensure that his kingdom comes. Be safe, and God bless you.